All right, let's get right into it. Today, we are tackling a huge topic, one of the most complicated and, frankly, controversial issues of our time, mass migration. We're going to unpack a global security analysis to really understand what causes it, the impact it has, and the intense politics that seem to follow it everywhere.
And just to get a sense of the sheer scale of what we're discussing, just look at this number. Back in 2020, almost 90 million people were displaced from their homes. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire population of Germany. It's an absolutely staggering figure, and it really sets the stage for everything we're about to cover.
So, to make sense of all this, we're going to walk through 5 key areas. We'll start by just defining what we're talking about. Then we'll look at the forces that actually drive it. After that, we'll analyze the impact, explore the political battlefield it creates, and finally, we'll look at the gap between what politicians promise and what actually happens.
Okay, first things first. Let's get our terms straight. What do we actually mean when we say mass migration? And, just as important, who are the people we're talking about? At its core, the definition from the source is pretty straightforward. Mass migration is just when large groups of people move from one place to another. But as you can imagine, hiding inside that simple definition is a whole world of complexity.
And here's where it gets really interesting. When you start to break down that 90 million number, look at that biggest bar, internally displaced people, or IDPs. These are people who had to flee their homes, usually because of a conflict or some kind of disaster, but they never actually crossed an international border. They are, for all intents and purposes, migrants inside their own country, and they make up the huge majority of this global figure.
So this is a really crucial point. The term migrant isn't just one single thing. The analysis shows us it's better to think about them in categories based on why they're moving. You've got economic migrants looking for a better job, forced migrants like refugees who are literally running for their lives, people who move outside the official rules, and even really complicated cases where the motives are all mixed up or sometimes even fake.
Okay, so that kind of covers the who. Now let's get into the why. What is it that actually makes millions of people take these journeys that are often so dangerous? Well, the analysis frames this with a really simple but powerful idea. It all boils down to 2 opposing forces: push factors and pull factors. You can think of it just like this. There are forces pushing people away from their homes, and then there are other forces pulling them toward a new place.
And this lays it out perfectly. On the push side, you've got really powerful things like a lack of jobs, political violence, or even environmental disasters. And on the pull side, well, that's the promise of better salaries, more freedom, or joining up with family who's already there. That's something called chained migration. So that big decision to move is almost always this complex balancing act between all these competing forces.
All right, so we get the why, but what happens next? What are the actual consequences? Let's take a look at the ripple effect of mass migration, both for the countries people leave and the countries they arrive in.
So first, what about the country people are leaving? Now, you might think it's all negative, but according to the analysis, not so fast. Remittances, that's money that migrants send back home, can be a massive source of income for a country. People can also learn new skills that they might bring back one day, and a successful community abroad can act as a kind of soft power, boosting a country's reputation and influence.
And if you want to put a number on those remittances, check this out. The money sent home to India shot up from $53 billion to an incredible $89 billion in just about a decade. That is a massive injection of cash that can genuinely change an economy.
But, of course, there is a very serious downside. It's a phenomenon people call the brain drain. The source points out that the continent of Africa, for example, loses about 70,000 skilled professionals every single year. That's doctors, engineers, scientists, and losing that talent can be absolutely devastating for a country's future.
Now let's flip it and look at the receiving state. This is where the security analysis really dives into some of the complex social and security issues that tend to dominate the headlines.
So one of the main concerns that gets highlighted is a potential strain on what's called social cohesion. The argument laid out here is that when you have large-scale immigration, especially from very different cultures, it can create friction and challenge a society's traditional values and way of life. And then there's the other big one, the economic concern. This is the idea that a large influx of people can put a real strain on public services. We're talking about the welfare state here, and especially things like healthcare, schools, and housing.
Right. And it's these impacts and concerns, both the ones that are real and the ones that are just perceived, that turn this whole issue into an intense political debate. This is the point where migration stops being just a social phenomenon and becomes an all-out political battleground. So the source breaks down the pro-immigration case, which is often tied to left-wing politics. The arguments include a moral one, that wealthy nations should help those in need, an economic one, that immigrants provide labor and start businesses, a cultural one, summed up by the phrase, diversity is our strength, and even a demographic one, about filling population gaps in aging societies.
And on the other side of the coin, you have the anti-immigration case, which is usually a central issue for right-wing politics. This position really doubles down on those security and economic concerns we just talked about. And as the source notes, talking tough on immigration is a very, very common political tactic.
And the rhetoric can get incredibly sharp. The analysis points to this quote from Donald Trump when he announced he was running for president back in 2015 as a really clear example of how that political messaging gets framed.
And this isn't just words. As you can see here, that kind of rhetoric often leads directly to huge policy proposals. In this case, the famous push to build a wall all along the US-Mexico border.
But this is where things get really, really complicated. Why is there so often this huge gap between the tough talk we hear from politicians and what governments are actually able to do about immigration?
Well, the analysis gives us 5 big reasons. First, sometimes the politicians just don't intend to follow through. It was only about winning votes. Second, it's just physically incredibly difficult to control thousands of miles of border. Third, doing it effectively costs a fortune. Fourth, you've got powerful businesses who are often pushing for looser immigration rules to get labor. And finally, there are international laws and treaties that put real limits on what a country is even allowed to do.
So after all of that, the drivers, the impacts, the politics, the analysis leaves us with this final, very provocative question to chew on. It basically challenges the very foundation of this whole debate. What is nationality? And should it be something that's permanent, something that you can't change? A really tough question and a fitting way to end our look at this incredibly complex topic.